Thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you today. I've got a bit of a cold, so my Scottish accent is going to be even more hard to discern than usual. Today, as was said, I'm going to talk about reading appetite cues in infancy, so I'm really switching gears. The previous speakers have talked about cohorts with thousands of participants, and I'm going to bring you to psychological studies which involve very tiny numbers, around 30 at a time. So I'm going to talk to you about how we read appetite cues in infancy. I'm going to talk a little bit about facial expressions and how to interpret facial expressions. And I'm also going to talk about overt behaviors that infants show so that we can understand what infants are telling us in relation to whether they like a food or not. And so I'll be talking a little bit about dislike and disgust, as well as liking and wanting. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the infant's dilemma. The infant's dilemma is where the infant moves from breast milk to solid foods. And that dilemma means that they have to use what's innate to them, as well as what they learn in relation to solid food consumption. And I'm going to then talk a little bit about how infants tell us that they like something and that they want something. Two different systems, two different types of behaviors. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we read appetite cues in infancy, because Anne Datillo this morning talked to us about responsive feeding, and I want to talk to you about how we recognize what infants are telling us if we want to respond to them properly. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about how responsive feeding and introduction of solids might be a perfect time for nutrition education. So not just when to offer solids, but what is offered and how foods are offered. So I'm going to start with the infant's dilemma. The infant is born a univore, highly adapted to consuming milk, and then at 6 months has to transition to an omnivore. And they are able to do this on the basis of what they're able to do innately, which they don't have to learn. And partly they are born with an innate liking of the sweet taste and an innate dislike of bitter. So this slide up here is of a baby having sucrose in solution, and this is a baby having quinine sulfate, a bitter taste. The other thing that babies can do very well is they learn, and they learn through experience. And that might be through their texture, the touch, the smell, the look of something, and eating something that's offered to them, but it also might be through mimicry. So little babies will learn through copying who's around them. So if mothers are eating broccoli and carrots, then it's more likely that the infant will eat broccoli and carrots. So this is called the omnivore's paradox. Paul Rosen from Penn talked about the omnivore's paradox. Infants have to transition from univore to omnivore. So it's a complex process. We share with other non-human primates a love of sweetness because other mammals have a preference for sweetness because milk is sweet. And there's also a negative reaction to bitter, because bitter might signal a toxin in nature. So we have an innate preference, but we can also learn through experience. And this is a baby being given green beans for the first time. So you can see that he's not terribly happy, but after a few experiences with green beans, he comes to like them. But of course, if mums anticipate this disgust reaction, they might not be so willing to offer the vegetable again. So it would be remiss of me not to mention one of the classic studies in this area by Clara Davis, because as a psychologist, I'm interested in what babies are equipped to do early on in life in relation to the innate capacity to like certain foods and dislike others, but also what it is that the child learns. Now, Clara Davis she's a pediatrician. She conducted this research study in the 1920s and the 1930s. And she offered babies at complementary feeding periods raw and cooked foods on a tray. And she wanted to find out what the children would consume. If they have an innate capacity to like sweetness, they might then just choose the sweet foods on a tray. But if they had this nutritional wisdom that she was interested in finding out about, then they would have a variety of foods. So this is some pictures from Clara Davis's research, so in the 1920s, 1930s. And the babies were given foods on a tray. The nurse was not supposed to help them. The nurse wasn't even supposed to communicate with them. They were just supposed to choose what they wanted. And Clara Davis was really scrupulous, and she even weighed the bibs so that she could find out how much was consumed and how much was wasted. The children also tried to eat the tray at times, but they found out they weren't edible. Now, of course, this study is flawed insofar as this was raw and cooked unprocessed foods. There were no mixtures of foods like soup or custard or bread. These were pure foods, raw and cooked. But what's interesting from the psychological point of view is that the babies did not just choose the sweet foods all the time. Babies chose a variety of foods. So this is breakfast and a 1-year-old infant choosing a variety of different foods and 21 grams of raw apple and 100 grams of cooked apple. So basically, this child is having a little bit of both, but much, much more of the cooked version than the raw. And at night time, the same 12-month-old infant is having 10 grams of raw oats and 56 grams of cooked oats. And what that tells me is that they are trying a little bit of lots of different things, but they're eating more of that which is more digestible and that which is probably better for them. Because even as a Scottish person, I will eat porridge, but not necessarily raw. I think cooked is much better. So what this study tells us is that the infants don't just choose a sweet or a favoured food and not just milk. They will consume a wide variety. And in Clara Davis's studies, these babies were healthy, they were well, and they learned what they liked through experience. So each infant in the beginning chose some foods, which he spat out. Later on, this did not happen. And in her research, she showed that the children were rollicking, rosy-cheeked children who thrived really well. Now, contrast that with the diets of American kids, and this is where we're looking at how much is consumed of fruits and vegetables. And this is nationally representative data of children 2 to 18 years. And what we see here is that children are eating much less than the recommended 1 to 3 cups of vegetables per day. So there's a gap between the recommended amount of vegetables and how much is actually consumed. And some have argued that that's because vegetables are slightly bitter. So children have an innate capacity to like sweetness, but perhaps they don't like bitter taste as much. Some have even suggested that the dislike of bitter is hardwired, and it's something that it's really difficult to get children to accept. But I would also argue that the difference between the recommended and the amount eaten of vegetables is partly due to what is actually offered to children. So if children aren't given a lot of vegetables, then they won't eat a lot of vegetables. Now, in this next slide, I'm embarrassed because the author is sitting in the audience, but there's a difference between how much is required in infancy and how much is consumed. And so from a psychological point of view, I wonder about the mismatch between the requirement of energy and how much is actually offered to children. And if their intake is different from requirements, we know that that's going to increase the likelihood of positive energy balance. And part of what I think is happening here then is that low energy density foods, which are nutrient rich, tend to be, in the vegetable group, for example, rather bitter and rather disliked by children. So I'm wondering whether or not this dislike is hardwired. So Kees de Graaf and his group in Wageningen University in the Netherlands actually said children's hardwired aversion to pure vegetable taste because he did an experiment where he added a little bit of sweetness to vegetables and still the children in the study didn't eat the vegetable juices. So foods which are low in energy density but rich in nutrients such as vegetables may be disliked. So when parents are offering these high energy density foods, they might be more acceptable. And certainly foods that are already very sweet are very well liked. They don't need to be learned about. Whereas vegetables which are bitter have to be learned about through experience. So can children acquire a liking for something that's bitter? So let me just show you, first of all, what children do when they're given a sweet taste or a bitter taste. So this is a study by Jakob Steiner from the 1970s, and these are facial expressions to a sweet taste. So this is sucrose in solution. And as you can see, there's the the tongue protrusion, showing that they like this substance. With sourness, there's lip pursing, and this is citric acid in solution. And then with quinine sulfate, the bitter component, you can see a gape. So the child is really showing an aversive reaction. And look at the eyes as well as the mouth. It's very, very profound. And as I said earlier, this response to bitterness is shared with other non-human primates. So if you look at infant experience with bitter, you can see the same response in the orangutan, in the tamarin monkey, and the rhesus monkey. And similarly, with sucrose in solution, there's the lip protrusion, the tongue protrusion, which is also shown in the orangutan. So is there a hardwired response to bitterness? It looks like that bitterness is disliked from early days, but that experience might actually increase the likelihood that they'll be eaten. So we conducted a study in Europe. We were funded by the European Union. This is before the UK voted to exit. So I don't know what the future will hold in terms of funding, but this was conducted whilst we were still in Europe. And what we did was we harvested artichokes in France, and we created a processed artichoke product, which we gave to children in England, in France, and in Denmark. We gave the artichoke plain, or we gave it with a little bit of added sugar, or we gave it with a little bit of added oil, with the idea that if you have a little bit of oil, you're increasing the energy density. If you have a little bit of sugar, you're increasing the likelihood it will be liked because it's sweet. And the plain artichoke, it was just plain on its own. And the idea behind this study was to find out if children would acquire a liking through multiple exposures. So the children were given 10 exposures to the artichoke. And what you find is that there's no additional benefit of adding oil, and there's no additional benefit of adding sucrose. So children accept artichoke over multiple exposures just through mere exposure and through familiarization. But we did find different patterns of acceptance of the vegetable. So, for example, these are children that we call learners. They eat very little the first couple of times they're offered the artichoke, but then they increase their intake of artichoke over time. And we also looked at children who cleaned the plate, children who just ate everything you gave them, as well as children who ate nothing, and who ate nothing every time you gave them the artichoke. And what we find is that the children who are plate clearers, the ones who will eat everything, are younger. So younger children, when the first experiences with artichoke, are more willing to have what you give them. And those who are non-eaters are the children who are high in satiety responsiveness. These are the children who fill up quickly and who will not eat a lot because they tend to be a little bit fussy and they tend to be high in satiety responsiveness. Now, what's interesting then is that mere exposure is not enough on its own. There's also something from the child itself. So if a child is fussy, then it's hard to encourage them to eat a bitter vegetable, for example. And if they have high satiety responsiveness, it's difficult. And these eating traits are highly heritable. So it's hard to do much about that other than to persist with exposure. Because even fussy children eat a little bit each time. So we created a feeding guide for parents across Europe, translated into 6 languages, to encourage parents to think about vegetables as a first food, and to encourage them to give a variety of vegetables so that children they acquire a liking for vegetables through familiarization. We also conducted some pilot studies, some focus group studies in the UK and in France. And what was interesting with the mothers of these children, we asked them, how do you give vegetables to the children? And the British did it by stealth. So they hid the vegetables in foods so the children didn't really know they were eating broccoli or spinach. They just hid them. Whereas the French were very proud to show that they were eating vegetables. And in fact, they used cooking liquor from the vegetables to add to milk to allow the children to develop a sense of taste. So in France, they say, excuse my accent, donner les bases du goût. So they're building the foundation of taste. So proudly giving the distinctive vegetable taste. So we learned from this by conducting a study with breastfeeding and formula-feeding mothers, an intervention where we added vegetables to milk and added vegetables to baby rice at the beginning of complementary feeding. So we created a guide for the mothers, and the mothers came to the laboratory so that we could film their baby's responses to vegetables. How much would they like the vegetables according to their facial expression, according to their behaviors when they were given vegetables. So we offered the babies a spoonful of the vegetable to find out what would happen, and whether the babies were a little suspicious or not, we recorded their responses. So in order to do the study, it was a very small sample. 40 mothers were randomized to the intervention of the control group, and only 36 mothers actually completed the study. It was a very long study. So we had mothers fairly well matched for age and education, and some of the babies were breastfed, some of the babies were formula fed. But the instruction was, when your baby is ready for complementary feeding, we would like you to add this pure vegetable to the milk if they were in the control group, if they were in the intervention group. If they were in the control group, they just fed as normal. So we had 12 days of plain milk in the control group, or 12 days of giving vegetables once a day added to milk. So added to either breast milk or to formula. And we did it on a rotation. So one day would be carrot, one day would be green bean, one day would be spinach, one day would be broccoli, and then we would repeat that pattern. And then for the following 12 days, twice a day, we gave a pure vegetable with baby rice. But in the control condition, they just had baby rice. And then by day 25, we brought the babies back into the lab so that we could look at their response to carrot and look at their response to green bean. Now, before I show you some of the images from that study, I just want you to see what milk and vegetable look like before it's been mixed together. But this is spinach green at the bottom of the milk, and then we flip it together and mix it. So this is what it looks like when we're adding either the carrot or the green bean to the baby rice or to the milk. And we added vegetable puree 40% by weight to breast or formula, and vegetable puree 70% by weight to baby rice. And we also conducted a sensory panel analysis to make sure that the vegetables were in fact detectable. And this was to adults, obviously. So we had a variety of different doses of the vegetable added to milk or baby rice, and we had a sensory panel evaluate these. And of course, we only chose the dose that was actually detectable. So the mothers fed their baby in the lab, and they were asked to stop when they had seen 3 refusals from the babies. And the mothers were given training on how to identify a refusal. So if the baby is looking away, turning their head away, pushing the spoon away, if the baby is looking away or looks very depressed, we know then that the baby has had enough of the food. And what the mother said to us was, this was really useful. It was really useful to see what a food refusal would look like and when to stop offering the food. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about how we might use that in another study. But in this study, liking was rated by the mother, by the researcher, and by an independent rater. And then we also filmed their responses to the different vegetables, and we weighed how much the children ate in the laboratory. So we looked at each spoonful, facial expressions, whether the baby is ready to open their mouth for the spoonful, what their expressions are, if their inner brow is scrunched together, if their noses are squinching, and then if they're ready for another spoonful. So even though this baby looks like they're not liking this food, when you offer another spoonful, she's ready to start again. So we did each spoonful, and we measured the approach behaviors. Are the babies ready to open their mouth? Are they ready to accept the spoonful? And then once the food is in the mouth, what is the facial expression that the babies are showing? And we looked at overt behaviors as a sort of indicator of wanting. So did they turn their head away when the spoon was offered? Did they push the spoon away? Did they start crying? And did they lean forward? So leaning forward is the only approach behavior that we saw in any kind of frequency. So these behaviors actually correlate well with how much is consumed. So the more the baby turns their head away from the spoonful, the less they'll eat. And the more the baby turns the head away, it's an inverse correlation with how much the mothers say that the child likes the food. So these behaviours correlate well with how much is consumed, as does the rate of acceptance, how fast they accept the spoonful of food. In the end, this study showed that those babies who'd been exposed to the vegetables through the course of the study ate consistently more of the vegetable, either the carrot or the green bean or the spinach. So overall, the intervention worked, even though it was small scale. Adding vegetables to milk and then adding it to baby rice increased the likelihood the child would eat that vegetable and show fewer negative facial expressions to the vegetables. So this is the behavioral data here and the facial expressions here. And what you see basically is that the control condition, they have more negative facial expressions than the intervention group. And what's also interesting about this slide is that even though the babies in the intervention group had had green bean, it was still disliked more than carrot. And we think that's because carrots are sweet and green beans are not. So we've conducted a number of different studies on vegetables as a complementary food, and with British Nutrition Foundation have published this paper on a consensus on vegetables first as a complementary food. We've also tried to look at ways that we can encourage mothers to increase the vegetable consumption of their children. So we think vegetables first is a good message, as is repeated exposure. Now in the UK, mothers will stop offering a vegetable after 3 exposures, but the average amount of time to like a green bean is 10. So 3 is not enough. It has to be between 10 and 15 times before the child will accept the vegetable. Initially, a negative facial expression might change to a more positive or neutral facial expression with multiple exposures. So learning to like vegetables is through experience, and also it's moderated by eating traits which are highly heritable. Food responsiveness, satiety responsiveness, enjoyment of eating, slowness in eating, these are all eating traits that can be measured through the BEBQ or the CEBQ developed by Jane Wardle and her team at UCL. And also it's interesting to look at babies' temperaments. So some children are more surgent, some children are more negative, and those will influence whether they're ready to accept certain foods. Also, children vary in the amount of self-regulatory ability that they have. So whilst we may promote vegetables first and we may say repeated exposure, these effects will be moderated by these different traits. So I want to switch now to talking about responsive feeding. So one trial that's been extremely successful and has a lot of kudos is the INSIGHT trial by Paul et al., partly from Penn State University and elsewhere, where they've been looking at responsive parenting. And one component of their trial is to use responsive feeding. So teaching parents to recognize hunger and satiety, providing age-appropriate portions for children, and to only feed children when they're hungry, not when they're distressed, and not when they're irritable, and not offering food as a reward. Now, the INSIGHT trial has shown really a successful outcome in terms of weight, BMI, Z-score in children, although it's a responsive parenting trial against a safety control group. So we don't know what component of the trial has actually produced the success, but nonetheless, responsive feeding is part of that trial. And my question as a psychologist is, how do we teach parents to be responsive in their feeding? And we've conducted a number of different systematic research reviews to look at what tools there are in order to be able to observe children's communication of infant hunger satiety. And there's not very many out there. There are few tools to investigate infant communication of hunger and satiety. So if we can't recognize it, how do we teach it to the parents? There's also a discrepancy between what mothers report and what we actually see in the laboratory. So one of my PhD students has recently been looking at gaze. So where did the children cast their gaze during a mealtime interaction? So she's looked at gesture, gaze, and vocalization. She recorded and coded mealtime interactions for, again, small number of children, 20, at 2 different meals, so 40 meal episodes. And all the babies had been breastfed for at least 25, about a mean of 25 weeks, and solid foods introduced at 22 weeks. And what she did was she looked at where the child was gazing. So in terms of gaze cues during a mealtime, what you see is that the babies look less and less and less at the food that's being offered over the course of the meal. But if you offer them a dessert, then they start to look again at the food, okay? That they're more interested in dessert. So gaze is an indicator of an interest in food, and it will decline over the course of a meal. An exploratory gaze, where they're not looking at the food, they're looking elsewhere, that increases over the course of a meal. So gazing at food during the dessert recovers and then declines at the end of the dessert. So children are communicating to their mothers through gaze, gesture, and vocalization. You don't just have to look at facial expressions or overt behaviors like turning the head away or pushing the spoon away. Also looking at gaze, looking at gesture. And this is just showing the signaling of social gesture, which increases because the children are getting bored with the food at the end of a meal, and they're more interested in gesturing socially. So we've used this information then about parenting to develop an educational resource to help mothers and childcare staff to recognize what hunger looks like, and especially what satiety looks like. Mothers are very good at knowing when their babies are hungry, but they're not so good at recognizing satiation and satiety. And that's where we've been inspired by the Nourish trial by Lynn Daniels in Queensland University of Technology, who used the Nourish trial to try to encourage positive feeding practices. So our resource is a very simple online resource, and mothers can use it interactively, and each of these slides is age-related. So if you're interested in what an 8-month-old looks like when they're hungry or full, or a 12-month-old or an 18-month-old, we've got the same baby filmed over many different meals. And the mums can click onto these video clips to see what is happening with the baby, so that they can understand what leaning means, and then when they're bored, what it looks like. And just to give you an idea, I've got a little clip here of what fullness looks like. So this baby is not interested. And yet some mums will continue to try to follow the babies around, try to distract them, try to do the airplane, etc. And this is another example of disinterest from the resource.
I don't think you wanted to eat it, are you? You want to throw it on the floor.
So, very successfully showing disinterest where she's just throwing the food away. So we've used this resource with healthcare professionals and with mothers to show especially what satiation and satiety looks like. And we've had a feasibility trial just to say that the resource was well organized, the material was presented well. So we've had feedback from mothers and from healthcare professionals to say that they think it's an acceptable resource. So our next step is to test the resource within a randomized controlled trial. And I have a clinical psychology student at the moment who's interested in pursuing that. We've also been doing some research looking at mealtime interactions in relation to milk feeding and then solid food feeding. And with my colleague Natalie Schleim, we've found that children who've been breastfed actually signal more to their mothers through a meal. And breastfed infants also have a more ideal mealtime interaction. So we've done a number of different small-scale studies to look at the cues that are being signaled by infants. So, and finally, I just want to say, infant hunger, appetite, and satiety cues are communicated by infants before, during, and at the end of the meal. These cues can be coded and are predictive of how much is consumed. The introduction of solids, therefore, is a teachable moment to read these cues. But when we say responsive feeding, we have to show parents what we mean by that. And if we're overfeeding children, it might be because we're ignoring some of those satiation and satiety cues. So responsive feeding can be part of nutrition education, but there are, of course, some caveats. And these are, I've just got rid of the caveat slide, sorry. These are that actually a lot of this work is infant-centric. That means that we are looking at children's individual needs. And so sometimes the feedback was, this is all very well for that child, but what about my child? So whilst we might be able to have resources which have generic information about noticing satiation and satiety, we really have to think about personalising it and customising it to individual families, particularly those families who have children who are very fussy, and remembering that fussiness is highly heritable and therefore quite difficult to manage. So I'll stop there and invite any questions. Thank you for your attention.